the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation has joined many other voices in condemning the war in Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine today began their third round of negotiations, with Ukrainian negotiator Mikhailo Podolyak urging Russia to halt attacks on civilians. Let's discuss this more with the Institute Head of Peace-Building Interventions, Professor Tim Murithi. Thank you very much, Prof, for joining us this evening. Maybe let me start by picking your brain on your level of confidence that the direction that these negotiations will take will be one in a positive one and will see the end to the terrorism or the killing of innocent people that is currently happening in Ukraine.
Thank you, Rofhiwa. In fact, as with the fact that we're talking about the third round of talks in less than 2 weeks, suggests that this is not likely to lead us to an outcome that will see the cessation of hostilities and the drawback of the Russian forces. As we speak, we heard that missiles are already flying into other cities around the country. So this does not really give us a lot of confidence that this is the pathway out of the current situation. I think the conversation needs to be broadened much more to include NATO members who are now arming Ukrainians with weapons to defend themselves against the Russian aggression. And we have to be very clear about this. This is an invasion from the political leadership in Moscow against Ukraine. But there is a very long historical context that goes back to 1992 and the end of the Cold War, which also saw the major standoff between the NATO alliance and the so-called Warsaw Pact that was led by the Soviet Union, which now Russia is a member of, Rofhiwa. And I think we can fast forward to some of the crises that actually did occur in 2008, for example, the invasion of Georgia, and 2014, the invasion and annexation of Crimea, which leads us up to this point. So we're looking at a conflict that actually has a much longer trajectory than what we are currently getting in terms of some of the analysis, Rofhiwa.
No, absolutely. And of course, it's an invasion that has traumatized many, many people in the Ukraine. And I just wonder, the non-binding condemnation by the United Nations of what's happening in Ukraine was enough. Should we have not seen something more come out of the UN?
Definitely, I agree with you on that point, Rofhiwa. The primary institution that has the responsibility for maintaining international peace and security is the United Nations Security Council. And because of the failures of the United Nations Security Council in terms of a veto of a draft resolution condemning Russia, the issue was shifted to the General Assembly, which does not have any enforcement powers. Now, it's the United Nations Security Council itself is part of the problem. It needs to be restructured. We need to talk about how this crisis, in fact, should be directing us towards a new global system of collective security and the restructuring of the UN Security Council. Some would say, in fact, even the abolishment of the UN Security Council, particularly the abolishment of the veto of the permanent 5 members that include the US, France, UK on the one side, who are all NATO members, and China and Russia on the other side. And Russia now is one of the belligerents in this crisis. So it's almost impossible for the Security Council to actually address this issue, which shows that it's now dysfunctional in the 21st century. We no longer need a Security Council that can't, in fact, protect innocent women and children and the elderly that we see now, trudging outside of, walking out of Ukraine to refugee camps in neighboring countries. And this is a fundamental issue that we've been arguing for quite a while, that UN security, the global security system, in fact, is not designed to address challenges of the 21st century. And the Ukrainian crisis has almost brought us a perfect storm of a situation where one of the belligerents is, in fact, Russia, that is supposed to be overseeing international peace and security, is now fighting a war against other belligerents, essentially Ukraine, but behind the scenes, the NATO, US, France, and UK, who are actually supporting the Ukrainian efforts to maintain their freedom and independence. And this suggests that the whole system is, in fact, in need of strong reform. And this hopefully will lead us in that direction. NATO is an integral partner of this discussion. If we try to exclude NATO from the conversations of how to resolve this crisis, I think we will have an incomplete agreement, and we will actually see a prolongation of the dispute going forward, Rofhiwa.
No, absolutely. Prof, how much of an impact does the decision by countries like South Africa to sit on the fence and not have an actual standing on the current situation have on the situation in Ukraine? Should we not see countries actually take a firm stand for or against a certain cause? But I'm just wondering, does it not hurt this particular endeavor further when we're seeing countries like South Africa, as I say, sitting on the fence and refusing to take a firm stand on what we're seeing happen there?
Well, South Africa is a sovereign nation, and at the level of the United Nations, almost all the decisions are made out of national interest. And you will know that South Africa, together with India, Brazil, and China, and Russia, are a member of this group called the BRICS, which means that South Africa has a certain degree of economic exposure to all of these countries, and therefore has to tread carefully. And this is partly informs the decision that was taken by both the presidency and informed by DIRCO. So it does appear to be almost abstaining from making a concrete decision, but there's some very clear-cut national self-interest issues behind the scenes. Now, the fact that this conflict, in fact, has drawn in the whole of the northern hemisphere, including US, Western Europe, European Union, and Russia, and potentially China at a later stage, means that perhaps there is now scope for the global south, Brazil, India, South Africa, to actually play some kind of a mediating role to find a way out of the current crisis, because it doesn't help for NATO members to go and try to mediate with Vladimir Putin in Moscow. You actually need actors that seem to have a certain degree of partiality to help resolve the current crisis. So there might be some method in this madness that we're witnessing at the moment in terms of the way the UN votes played out at the General Assembly, and I think we should leave pathways back to peace open. Otherwise, we will continue to see more and more innocent civilians dying and people being forced to flee very long distances, driving with children, and it's almost unimaginable what they're having to deal with on the ground, and this has led to high levels of trauma that you can see. This is an experience we, as the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, have witnessed also in other conflict situations across the African continent. High levels of trauma caused by displacement and refugee flows, and therefore there's a strong need for psychosocial mental health support to these people who are really been shaken out of something that they were familiar with. And this is the work that we do in terms of transitional justice and peace building, to look at addressing the current underlying drivers of the conflict in order to be able to effectively put in place processes, mechanisms, and institutions to prevent future violence from occurring. And this is currently where we are. There's a European Union policy framework on transitional justice. There's a United Nations report on transitional justice, and an African Union transitional justice policy also, which provides clear guidelines of how the Russian forces and the Ukrainian authorities, as well as NATO alliance, can actually de-escalate this crisis and find a pathway out of the conversation of the current situation that we are. And I think that's something that we should be reflecting, even as we watch all the sensational images coming out of the current situation. People's lives are being deeply affected. And we should nevertheless be constantly thinking about how we are going to help these countries to actually move out of crisis. You just talked briefly a short while ago about how the economic consequences of this conflict could actually be much more wide-ranging in terms of fuel, the impact on fuel prices, even in South Africa. So people will say, well, why should we care about this crisis? It does ultimately end up affecting the whole world, and it's something that we should all put our energies into thinking how we can get out of the current situation. Rofhiwa.
No, absolutely. Professor Tim Murithi, thank you for joining us this evening. He's from the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, just breaking down some of the details of what's currently unfolding between Russia and Ukraine and a way forward that needs to be derived because, as you've just heard him say, the entire world is being affected by what's happening in Europe.